Hook, imagine this. You are lying down, drifting towards sleep. The world is quiet around you, but in your mind's eye, you are not in your bed. Instead, you are standing in the heart of ancient Rome. The air is heavy with dust, sweat, and the faint iron scent of blood. You hear the muffled roar of a crowd somewhere far above you. Their voices blend into a dull, endless hum, like waves against stone. And you realize you are not a free citizen, not a spectator, not a senator or merchant or noble. You are a gladiator. But the life of a gladiator was not the glorious tale that poets in Hollywood would later tell. It was not endless victories, shining armor, or noble battles under the sun. No, it was long days of hunger, endless training, aching wounds, and the knowledge that tomorrow, or the next day, or perhaps next month, you might be sent into the sand to die for the amusement of strangers. To be a gladiator was to be both famous and forgotten. To be cheered in the morning and buried by nightfall. To eat barley and beans while others feasted on meat and wine. To dream of freedom but to sleep in chains. This is the story of why it truly, deeply, profoundly sucked to be a Roman gladiator. And as you listen, the details may blur together, the voices of the past may become distant, and you may feel your eyes growing heavy. That is fine. For this history is not meant to rouse you to battle, but to lull you gently into the soft silence of sleep. The story of the gladiator does not begin in the roaring Colosseum of Rome, nor in the grand arenas of the empire. It begins much earlier, in the shadowed rituals of the ancient Etruscans. Before Rome was Rome, before the empire stretched its hand across seas and mountains, there were small city-states, each with their own traditions. Among these people, death was not seen as a clean break. It was a passage, a bridge between the world of the living and the world of spirits. And for the Etruscans, that bridge was painted in blood. At funerals, to honour the dead, men were made to fight one another. They were not professionals. They were slaves, prisoners, or unlucky souls chosen to satisfy tradition. Their deaths, or sometimes their wounds, were believed to honour the deceased, offering strength and passage to the spirit on its journey beyond. It was not yet entertainment. It was ritual. Sacred, grim, and necessary. The crowd was not there to cheer but to witness. The fallen man's blood was thought to cleanse, to consecrate, to bind the living to the dead. When Rome rose from these early cultures, it borrowed and reshaped their customs. The Romans were practical, always eager to turn old traditions into something new, something that fit their vision of power. And so the funerary blood ritual became a public spectacle. By the 3rd century BCE, wealthy Roman families began staging fights at the funerals of their great men. To honour a senator or a consul, slaves would be made to duel before the mourners. What had once been quiet and sacred became loud and violent, framed not by grief but by spectacle. The people noticed. The crowds grew. Death, when placed on display, had a strange attraction. The blood that once sanctified the grave now entertained the living. Over time, it mattered less who had died and more who would fight. Rome, hungering always for more, discovered something irresistible, the power of violence to hold an audience captive. And so, what began as a sombre ritual transformed into a profession. Men would be trained, armed, and disciplined for this purpose alone. No longer a sacrifice at funerals, but a career of suffering in the sand. Thus, the gladiator was born, not as a hero, not as a soldier, but as an offering to the hunger of the crowd. The first official games were small, almost clumsy by later standards. Just a few men clashing before the mourners, steel flashing briefly, blood darkening the earth. But with each passing generation, the games grew. More men, more weapons, more blood, more blood. Rome expanded, and with it, so did the appetite for violence. What once belonged to the tomb now belonged to the arena. The gladiator in his earliest form was a reminder of death. But soon he would become something more, an idol of brutality, a symbol of Rome's control over life itself. A figure who lived and died not for the gods, but for the people, and for their endless thirst for spectacle. And thus, as night stretches slowly across your room and your eyes begin to grow heavy, you can almost hear it, the first clang of sword against sword, the first cries of men fighting not for victory, but for honour they would never taste. The story has only just begun. To understand the gladiator, one must understand Rome itself. Rome was not just a city. It was an idea, a machine, a beating heart that fed on power and order. Every stone street, every marble temple, every dusty tavern whispered the same truth. Rome ruled and all others obeyed. In such a world, the gladiator existed both at the center of attention and at the very bottom of society. The Roman elite, senators, generals, wealthy merchants, looked upon gladiators as useful tools. They were symbols of control, reminders of conquest. Most gladiators were slaves, dragged from the far edges of the empire: Gauls, Thracians, Greeks, Africans. Men captured in war, stripped of homeland and family, thrown into chains, and forced into a life where their bodies were no longer their own. To the elite, these men were trophies. They were living proof that Rome's reach stretched beyond seas, mountains, and deserts. Yet, for the common citizen of Rome, the gladiator meant something different. In the crowded markets and narrow alleys, people spoke of the games as if they were festivals, holidays of blood. The butcher, the baker, the soldier's wife, all of them looked forward to the spectacle. The gladiator was both despised and admired. On one hand, he was a slave, a man of low birth, condemned to fight for survival. On the other, he was a creature of strength and courage, facing death in ways ordinary citizens could only imagine. Children played games in the streets, pretending to be Mamillos with heavy helmets or nimble Ricciarii with nets and tridents. Merchants sold cheap carvings of gladiators as souvenirs. Poets whispered verses comparing the clash of steel to the thunder of gods. And in the hushed, dark corners of the city, women, and sometimes men, dreamed of gladiators as lovers, drawn to the dangerous magnetism of men who lived each day at the edge of death. But admiration was mixed with scorn. A gladiator might be celebrated in the arena, his name cheered as he dealt a fatal blow. Yet, when the fight was over, he returned to his cell, still a slave, still a man of no honour. Roman society was careful to keep the boundaries clear. A gladiator might be adored, but he was never respected as an equal. He was entertainment, not citizen. He was glory and shame woven into one. And what of the emperors? They saw in the games not merely blood, but power. Bread and circuses, the phrase went. Feed the people, entertain them, and they will not rise against you. The gladiator was a pawn in this greater game. His suffering was a tool, his death a distraction, his victories a spectacle that kept the restless crowds quiet. In this strange, paradoxical world, the gladiator lived a life unlike any other, hated and loved, feared and pitied, cheered in the morning, forgotten by night. The people needed him, yet despised what he represented. And so the gladiator stood in the centre of Rome's most crowded spaces, yet remained utterly alone. As you listen, you may feel the weight of that contradiction. The slow pull of history presses gently like a heavy blanket. The names, the faces, the endless roar of a Roman crowd, all of it fades, becomes a distant hum. The gladiator is remembered yet faceless, a symbol yet forgotten. And so as night deepens, we move further into his world. Behind every clash of swords, behind every roar of the crowd, behind every drop of blood spilled in the sand, there was money. Rome was an empire built not only on conquest, but on calculation. And the gladiatorial games, though dressed in the robes of honour and tradition, were, at their core, a business, a costly business and a profitable one. To stage a set of games was no small affair. The hiring of gladiators, the construction of temporary wooden arenas in smaller towns, or the maintenance of great stone amphitheatres in the cities, all of it demanded coin. Wealthy men, eager for status, paid for these spectacles. A senator seeking election, or a magistrate hoping to curry favour with the public, would sponsor a series of games. The people, grateful for the entertainment, remembered his generosity when it came time to cast their votes. Thus, the blood of gladiators was a currency of power. The lanista, the owner of gladiator schools, dealt in men the way merchants dealt in grain or cattle. He bought slaves, prisoners of war, and condemned criminals, training them to fight. Each gladiator was an investment. Food, lodging, weapons, and medical care all cost money. A strong, skilled fighter might live long enough to bring fame to his school, drawing higher rents from sponsors who wished to borrow his skill for the arena. Others, weaker or less fortunate, perished quickly, their bodies discarded like broken tools. Tickets, of course, were not sold in the way we think of today. Most of the games were free to the public, a gift from the sponsor to the people. But nothing in Rome was truly free. The cost was hidden in the taxes collected, in the grain distributed, in the subtle chains of loyalty that bound citizen to patron, poor to rich. The people cheered for the games, but their cheering repaid a debt of politics, a silent acknowledgement of who held the purse strings. Even within the arena, the economy thrived. Merchants sold food and drink to the crowds: bread, olives, wine watered down for long afternoons beneath the sun. Craftsmen carved small tokens, charms shaped like helmets or tiny swords, souvenirs to be clutched by children or carried home by weary spectators. The games created not just entertainment, but a marketplace, a flow of coin through every street that touched the amphitheatre's shadow. And then there was betting. Romans, ever hungry for chance, laid wagers on the outcomes of duels. A Milo against a Retiarius, a veteran against a newcomer, money changed hands as eagerly as blood was spilled. Some men made fortunes in a single day, while others lost enough to sink their households into debt. The fates of gladiators were written not only in steel, but in the scratch of wax tablets tallying bets. For the emperors, the games were even more valuable. To them, the arena was a theatre of control. The people might grumble at taxes, at shortages of grain, at the weight of empire pressing on their shoulders. But when the games began, their voices softened into cheers. The emperor's gift of spectacle kept their anger at bay. And what was the cost of a few hundred slaves, a few thousand beasts, a few rivers of blood, compared to the peace of the capital? For rulers, the economics of blood were far cheaper than rebellion. And so, as you lie quietly, perhaps hearing only the faint hum of the night outside your own window, you might imagine the hum of ancient Rome, coins clinking, merchants calling, the rustle of togas in crowded stands, and beneath it all, the sound of men waiting in the darkness of the arena's cells. Their lives were measured not only in years or battles, but in coin. They were bodies with a price tag, instruments in the endless exchange of money and power. In Rome, even blood was an investment, even death had a ledger. And now, slowly, we drift onward, to the men themselves, to the fate of those captured and condemned, who were pulled into this strange, costly world of sand and steel. The life of a gladiator rarely began with choice. Few men ever woke up one morning and declared they wished to step into the arena. More often, the road to the sand began with loss, with chains, with conquest, or with crime. Many gladiators were prisoners of war. Rome, ever expanding, pulled its borders outward like a net, swallowing lands and peoples. When a Roman legion marched into Gaul or Thrace or the deserts of North Africa, it did not return empty-handed. It brought back prisoners, men who had fought bravely but had lost. These captives, stripped of their homes, their weapons and their freedom, were sold at markets like cattle. A lanista, owner of a gladiator school, might purchase them, seeing in their strong bodies the raw material of a fighter. Others came from crime. A man condemned for theft or even murder might be sentenced ad ludem to the gladiator school. Rome believed punishment should not only correct, but entertain. Why waste a criminal in some forgotten prison when his suffering might fill an afternoon for 50,000 spectators? Thus, the condemned were branded, chained, and marched off to lives of forced combat, and then there were the volunteers, rare but not unknown. A free man crushed by debt might sell himself into the gladiator's contract, binding his name to a life of blood for the promise of coin. For some, it was desperation. For others, the strange allure of fame, brief, burning, and almost always fatal. The Roman word for such a man was auctoratus, one who had authored his own enslavement. Imagine, for a moment, the journey of the captured. A young Thracian, perhaps, torn from his village after battle, wrists bound with rough rope, marched in a column of prisoners. Days, weeks, even months of travel across unfamiliar land, fed little more than stale bread and thin water. At the end of that march, an auction block. Buyers in fine robes walking among the defeated, appraising their shoulders, their legs, their teeth, a nod, a gesture, a clink of coin. And suddenly his life belonged to a stranger. His name was lost. He was no longer son, nor brother, nor husband. He was property. For the condemned criminal, the descent was swifter, but no less cruel. Arrest, trial, sentence, perhaps a moment's hope of appeal, quickly dashed. Then the branding iron, the chains, the escort through the city streets toward the ludus. Neighbours might watch him pass, whispering of his crimes, some pitying, others eager for the day they would see his punishment unfold beneath the hot sun of the amphitheatre. The volunteer, too, faced his own transformation. He walked into the school with his own feet, yes, but when the contract was signed, when the stylus scratched his name into wax, he ceased to be free. Whatever dreams or desperation had led him there, he was now no different from the captive at the auction or the thief in chains. In the eyes of Rome, he was a gladiator, and nothing more. The path to the arena was paved with defeat, disgrace, and despair. Whether by war, by crime, or by choice, men were funneled into the same dark corridor of fate. And once inside, the world they had known vanished behind them. Ahead lay only the iron gates of the ludus, the long grind of training, and the ever-present shadow of death. As you breathe softly now, you can almost hear the shuffle of chained feet on stone, the heavy creak of wooden doors closing behind them, the silence of men who know their lives are no longer their own. They are captured, they are condemned, and their story is just beginning. Beyond the city streets, behind tall stone walls and iron gates, lay the world of the ludus, the gladiator school. To cross its threshold was to step into a place that was neither prison nor barracks, but something between the two. It was a factory of flesh, a place where men were broken down, reshaped and sharpened into instruments of spectacle. At first glance, the ludus might seem like any other compound of Rome. Rows of rooms, training yards, kitchens, armourers, but its purpose was unlike anything else. The men who lived within were not citizens, not soldiers, not slaves in the fields. They were gladiators in the making, property in training. The day began early. Before dawn, when the city still lay in shadows, the sound of footsteps echoed across the training yard. Guards carried torches. In the lanista, the owner, might appear to watch. The men, whether newly captured or seasoned, were herded into routines, running laps to build endurance, lifting weights made of stone to strengthen arms and shoulders. Wooden swords, heavy and blunt, were placed in their hands, forcing them to learn the motions that might one day mean life or death. There was discipline, too, hard and unforgiving. A mistake in formation brought the crack of a whip. A refusal to obey meant chains, sometimes worse. The ludus was not gentle because the arena was not gentle. Every lesson was meant to prepare men for the sand, where mercy did not exist. And yet, the ludus was also a place of strange care. Gladiators were valuable property after all. They were fed more generously than ordinary slaves. Their diet was designed to build bulk and strength: barley porridge, beans, dried fruit, sometimes cheese or meat, not a feast but fuel. They were treated by doctors, men skilled in tending wounds and mending bones. Bruises, cuts, even broken limbs were patched together. For a dead gladiator was wasted coin. A living one, patched and healed, could fight again. The training was endless repetition. Strike, block, step. Strike, block, step. A wooden sword grew heavier with each hour, arms aching, legs trembling. But slowly the motions became instinct. A man who had once been a farmer, or a thief, or a soldier in another land, began to move like a gladiator, measured, disciplined, deadly. There was also the matter of weapons and armour, chosen carefully by the lanista. Each man was shaped into a type. The heavily armed Murmillo with sword and shield, the agile Retiarius with net and trident, the 3x with curved blade and small shield. Their training reflected their roles until each was moulded into a distinct image, recognisable to the crowd. Rome loved variety, and the ludus supplied it. At night, the men returned to their cells, small, bare, sometimes shared with another fighter. The air was thick with sweat, with fatigue, with silence. Some prayed softly, whispering to gods of their homeland. Some sharpened weapons or traced scars along their arms. Others simply lay on the stone floor, staring into darkness, waiting for the next day to begin. It was a strange existence, punished like criminals, fed like athletes, trained like soldiers, yet belonging to none of these worlds. For inside the ludus, men lost their pasts and futures alike. They became creatures of the present moment, of the next swing, the next strike, the next breath. If you listen closely now, you might hear it, the thud of wooden swords against shields, the sharp call of the trainer, the grunt of men forcing themselves to keep moving long after their bodies beg for rest. The ludus was a place of sweat, pain, and endurance. It was the crucible where men were reforged, until nothing of their old lives remained. And so, the days passed within those walls, training, eating, sleeping, training again. Weeks bled into months, for some even years, and always the looming knowledge that all of it, every bruise, every scar, every lesson was leading to a single destination, the arena. A man cannot fight on an empty stomach. Even Rome, ruthless as it was, understood this truth. And so, within the walls of the ludus, gladiators were given food. Not lavish feasts, not the delicacies of emperors and senators, but a careful, calculated diet designed for one purpose: to build bodies that could endure the arena. The Romans had a name for them: Hodiorie, the barley men. Oh, the barley men. For barley was their main fuel, not soft white bread of fine flour, the kind served in the homes of patricians, but heavy loaves of coarse grain, dark and filling. The gladiator's stomach was lined with it morning and night, a slow-burning source of strength. Alongside it came beans, boiled or mashed into thick porridge, heavy with starch, swelling the belly, adding bulk to limbs that would need to withstand the clash of steel. It was a diet of weight, not grace. Rome wanted its fighters thick, solid, their bodies padded not with fat, but with dense muscle and a protective layer of flesh. The games were not about beauty, but about survival. A thin man, wiry and fragile, might bleed too quickly. A heavy man, fueled by barley and beans, might absorb a wound long enough to keep the crowd entertained. Meat was rare. Contrary to what we might imagine, gladiators were not fed like kings of the arena. Their food was simple, monotonous, filling rather than flavourful. On occasion they were given dried figs, a wedge of cheese, perhaps a handful of olives. Sometimes bones were boiled into broth, the marrow stirred into the pot. But the rich banquets of roasted boar, honeyed wine, and fresh seafood belonged to the world beyond the ludus walls. Gladiators did not dine. They consumed fuel like oxen set to labour, and yet there was method to this simplicity. The starch-heavy diet gave their bodies a certain heaviness, a thickness that dulled the sharp edge of injury. Cuts that might have pierced deeper in a leaner man sometimes lodged shallow in the bulk of a gladiator's flesh. Barley, beans and porridge were not just cheap, they were, in their own way, protective. They were also given strange tonics, brews made from ashes and vinegar. Ash, rich in minerals, was believed to strengthen bone. Vinegar, sour and sharp, was mixed with water to quench thirst and preserve health. The taste was bitter, but health was more important than pleasure. Rome invested in its fighters as one invests in livestock, ensuring they were strong, enduring and profitable. Picture it now, rows of men sitting on rough benches, wooden bowls in their hands, steam rising from pots of porridge. The sound of spoons scraping, the low murmur of voices, the clatter of clay cups as sour drinks were swallowed. There was little joy in these meals, but there was a strange silence, a sense of shared endurance. Each man eating not for himself, not for pleasure, but for the battle that would come. And at night, as they lay in their cells, the heaviness of barley and beans pressed down upon them, pulling them into uneasy sleep. Dreams, if they came, were clouded with hunger for the flavours they would never taste again. A farmer might remember the sweetness of milk from his homeland. A soldier might recall the sharp taste of wine from a captured city. A thief might dream of stolen figs, dripping with sugar. But in the morning they would wake again to porridge and ash, the food of the damned, the food of men whose worth was measured in how long they could survive under the sun of the arena. And so, meal by meal, day by day, the gladiator's body was shaped, not by choice, not by luxury, but by necessity. Necessity. Each bite was another step on the slow march toward the sand, another reminder that his life was not his own. If the ludus shaped the gladiator's body, the arena shaped his identity. And that identity was written not only in scars and sweat, but in steel. To the Romans, variety was everything. A gladiator was not simply a man with a sword. He was a role, a costume, a spectacle carefully designed to thrill the crowd. His armour, his weapon, even the way he fought were chosen to balance risk, drama, and the strange theatre of death. The murmillo was among the most common. Heavy, broad, a figure of brute force. He carried a large rectangular shield, the scutum, its curved wood taller than his chest. In his right hand gleamed the gladius, the short sword that gave the gladiator his very name. Upon his head rested a great helmet, gleaming bronze, its crest shaped like the fin of a fish. Through narrow slits his eyes peered out, his breath echoing within the metal shell. To the crowd he was power embodied, slow, strong, relentless. Opposite him might stand the rosarius, the net fighter, dressed in startling contrast. No heavy helmet, no thick armour, no shield. Instead, he carried a weighted net in one hand and a trident in the other, his body bare save for a padded arm guard and a shoulder plate. Agile, swift, he darted like a fisherman of men, casting his net to entangle, thrusting his trident with deadly reach. Where the murmillo was brute strength, the rosarius was cunning speed. Their duels were not merely combat, they were theatre, a clash of opposites, force against finesse. Then there was the 3X, the Thracian, whose curved sword The Seeker was shaped like a crescent moon. With his small square shield and high-crested helmet, he danced about the arena, slicing from unexpected angles. His blade could reach behind a man's shield, striking where defense seemed certain. The crowd loved his cunning strikes, his sudden bursts of movement, his style drawn from lands once conquered and enslaved. Others bore stranger forms still. The Secutor, the Pursuer, was made as a counterpart to the Retiarius, his smooth helmet leaving no protrusions for a net to snag. His visor held only 2 small holes, barely enough to breathe, turning his combat into a slow suffocation as he lumbered after his nimble foe. There were also the Hoplomachii, armed like Greek warriors, with spear and round shield, evoking old battles of myth and history. And the Provocators, the challengers who fought only one another, their duels staged as contests of equals. Each type was a costume in Rome's theatre of blood. The armour was not designed only for protection, nor the weapons only for killing. They were balanced carefully, matched deliberately, to produce long fights, uncertain outcomes, and endless variety. A Mamillo against a Retiarius was a play of strength and speed. A 3-axe against a Hoplomachus was a clash of styles from different lands. The crowd, restless and eager, was never given monotony. Every pairing was a story, every duel a drama, and yet, within that glittering display, the men beneath the helmets remained the same. Slaves, captives, criminals. Their armour, though bright beneath the sun, was not freedom but costume. A gladiator's helmet was not a crown, it was a mask, hiding the face of a man who no longer owned his own life. Picture them now, standing in the training yard as the sun sets, each one fitted with helmet and shield, the metallic smell of iron filling the air. The Mamillo shifting under the weight of his shield, the Retiarius twirling his net, practicing its cast, the 3-axe testing the curve of his blade. From above, the Lannister watches, satisfied. They are no longer men. They are roles, living weapons, each one sharpened not for victory, but for the crowd's delight. And as you listen, perhaps you hear the slow clang of metal, the muffled breath inside a helmet, the faint hiss of a blade sliding against a shield. A chorus of steel echoing across centuries, lulling you into silence. Inside the gladiator school, life was lived shoulder to shoulder. Men ate together, trained together, bled together. The walls of the ludus were high, its gates locked, and within that narrow world, bonds formed in ways both fragile and fierce. A gladiator could not survive alone. The days of training were long, the routines harsh, the punishments cruel. To endure, a man leaned on the strength of those around him. In the evenings, when wooden swords were set aside, conversations murmured softly in the dim light. Men from distant lands exchanged stories of their homes, a Thracian recalling green hills, a Gaul speaking of cold forests, an African whispering of deserts stretching forever beneath the sun. In sharing memory they found companionship. In battle drills, too, trust was essential. A man had to believe his training partner would strike true, but not kill. Wooden swords could bruise, even break bones, but they were not meant to end lives. There was a rhythm to it. Strike, block, recover. Day after day, in that rhythm, a strange harmony grew. Brothers in the art of survival, brothers in the shadow of death. Yet beneath this brotherhood, rivalry smouldered. For each man knew that one day the friend he shared bread with might stand opposite him in the arena. The laughter of an evening might be silenced in the sand, one man victorious, the other lying still. Trust was always fragile, always haunted by the looming truth. Survival often came at another's expense. There were jealousies too. A gladiator who won favour with the Lannister or the crowd might be envied. A Mamillo who defeated a famed opponent might receive better food, a new piece of armour, perhaps even the rare gift of a coin. Others, overlooked, simmered with quiet resentment. Respect in the ludus was earned not with words but with victories, and victories were never shared. Sometimes bonds were deeper, even tender. Men who had nothing else left, no family, no freedom, clung to one another in quiet friendship or more. In whispered conversations in the darkness, they spoke of dreams of survival, of earning the wooden sword of freedom, the rudis. They promised, if one should live and the other fall, to remember each other's name. In such oaths, there was a kind of defiance, a way to be human in a place designed to strip away humanity. But betrayal was always possible. A man who sought to climb higher in the Lannisters' favour might turn against his fellows. Rumours, secrets, plots, they slipped like shadows through the cells. A word whispered at the right moment, an accusation placed with care, and one rival could be punished while another prospered. The ludus was both prison and home. It was a place where men were caged, yet where bonds of steel were forged between them. Some friendships ended only in the arena, sealed in blood. Others endured, carrying men through the darkest nights. Brotherhood and rivalry existed side by side, as inseparable as sword and shield, as constant as the shadow of death. Now, if you close your eyes, you might picture it. A dim barracks, firelight flickering on rough stone, the low hum of voices, laughter in a dozen accents, a song from a distant land sung softly to weary ears. And beneath it all, the unspoken knowledge that tomorrow, or next week, or next month, those same voices might be silenced by the roar of the crowd. In the ludus, every friend was also a rival. Every bond was written in the sand. The games did not begin with the clash of sword against shield. They began with something darker, a stranger, and in their own way, even more unsettling. As dawn broke over the amphitheatre, the Roman crowd gathered, restless, chattering, hungry for diversion. The air was cool still, the sand freshly raked, the great gates ready to creak open. The gladiators waited their turn, but first came the Venetians, the morning hunts. From the shadowed cages beneath the arena, animals were led into the light. Rome gathered beasts from every corner of its empire, filling its amphitheatres with living trophies of conquest. Lions from Africa, bears from the northern forests, leopards from distant lands, even crocodiles and rhinoceroses on rare occasions, all forced into the arena, far from their native soil. For the Romans, the sight was marvellous. The empire itself displayed, living proof of its power stretched across the known world. The hunts were spectacles of death disguised as entertainment. Specially trained fighters, the Scarii, armed with spears, nets, and sometimes nothing more than courage, faced the beasts before the delighted eyes of the crowd. The audience gasped as lions lunged, as leopards sprang, as hunters fought for their lives against claws and fangs. Sometimes the beasts won, tearing men apart. More often they fell, pierced by blades, collapsing in the dust as the crowd cheered. But animals were not the only ones brought forth in those early hours. The arena was also the stage of execution. Criminals, rebels, and prisoners of war, condemned men, were sent into the sand to die for the amusement of Rome. Their deaths were sometimes swift, a sword or an arrow ending their lives in moments. At other times, they were staged as grim performances, punishments turned into cruel theatre. There were the damnati ad bestias, the condemned to the beasts, thrown unarmed before lions or bears, their screams drowned by the crowd's laughter and applause. Others were forced to reenact myths in twisted form, a man dressed as Orpheus torn by animals, or another cast as Icarus hurled from a high platform, his waxen wings burning. To the Roman mind, these were not executions but spectacles, a mingling of punishment and performance. The morning hunts served a purpose. They warmed the crowd, stirred the appetite for blood, filled the hours until the true centerpiece of the day, the gladiators, took the stage. The hunts reminded Rome of its empire's reach, its mastery over beast and man alike. They thrilled, they horrified, they entertained, and yet, to the gladiators waiting in the darkness beneath the arena, listening to the roars and the screams above, the hunts were more than entertainment. They were a reminder of what awaited those who failed. For a gladiator who lost too often, who displeased the crowd or the editor of the games, the beasts might become his executioners. The line between fighter and victim was perilously thin. Close your eyes and you might imagine it now. The golden sun climbing above the amphitheatre, the murmur of tens of thousands swelling into a roar. The gate creaks open, and into the light pads a lion, its mane glowing like fire, its breath steaming in the morning air. A man with a spear stands trembling before it. The crowd leans forward. Death has entered the sand, and the day has only just begun. The gladiators wait, silent in their cells, knowing that their own moment will come when the sun climbs higher, when the sand is already wet with the blood of beasts and condemned men. The arena is never clean. It is always stained before their turn arrives. The Roman games were not brief. They were not swift amusements to be consumed in passing. They were full-day affairs, vast and sprawling, designed to fill every moment from morning to dusk with spectacle. To attend the games was to step into a world where time itself seemed suspended, where the outside city faded, and only the drama of the amphitheatre remained. The day began with anticipation. Even before dawn, citizens streamed toward the amphitheatre, clutching their tokens of admission. Crowds gathered in the streets, pushing, murmuring, excited. The amphitheatre loomed vast and immovable, its arches catching the first glow of the sun. Vendors shouted, selling bread, olives, and wine to the early arrivals. The air carried the mingled sense of food, sweat, and expectation. At the opening, the editor of the games, the sponsor, whether an emperor, a magistrate, or a wealthy patron, was celebrated with cheers. He was the one who paid for the blood, and the crowd owed him their entertainment. His entrance was part of the spectacle, a performance of generosity, power, and prestige. The morning belonged to the hunts and the executions, the venations, the punishments, the grim amusements that softened the crowd's restlessness. Beasts roared, men screamed, and the sun climbed slowly higher as the amphitheatre filled with sound. By midday, when the sun was harsh and the sand already darkened, the crowd grew restless again. This was the time of the Meridiani, a cruel interlude in which condemned men were executed in brutal fashion, dispatched quickly before the audience's eyes. Their deaths were considered little more than filler, something to pass the hour until the true entertainment arrived. And then, as the day edged into afternoon, came the moment for which the people had truly gathered, the gladiators. The entry itself was a ceremony. The fighters marched into the arena in procession, each man announced by name, each displaying his arms and armour. Trumpets blared, and the crowd erupted into cheers, jeers, or chants of familiar favourites. Men who had fought before were recognised, their reputations preceding them. New faces were appraised, their fates already whispered about by those who thought they could read destiny in a man's stride. Before the combat began, the gladiators saluted the editor, sometimes raising their weapons, sometimes offering the famous, though not always spoken, words, a Caesar, mortuary te salutant, Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. The matches unfolded one by one, carefully arranged for maximum drama. A secutor with his heavy shield faced a retiarius with net and trident, a slow armoured hunter against a swift, lightly armed prey. A Mamillo clashed with a Thracian, each style chosen to balance strength against agility, defence against offence. The crowd leaned forward with every strike, every feint, every stumble in the dust. Between bouts, there were pauses, moments to rake the sand, to remove the bodies, to allow the spectators to drink, eat, and gossip. The games were as much social ritual as blood sport. Senators debated politics in the shaded seats, merchants struck bargains, lovers whispered in corners of the stands. For them, the games were theatre and marketplace, spectacle and society mingled together. As the afternoon wore on, the tension built. The early matches tested the crowd's mood, but the final pairings, the headliners of the day, were designed to bring the greatest drama. By then, the audience was drunk on heat, wine, and the thrill of death. Each blow, each fall drew shouts and cries. Dust swirled in the sunlight, mingling with the smell of blood, and always at the climax of a fight came the choice. A fallen gladiator, wounded and beaten, raised his finger in appeal. The crowd roared, some shouting for mercy, others for death. The editor, seated in his place of honour, weighed the voices, weighed the spectacle, and at last gave his signal. Thumbs pressed downward, or perhaps sideways, or perhaps raised. It is debated still, but the meaning was always the same, life or death, decided not by the gods but by men. The day of the games was long, merciless, and hypnotic. It rose with beasts in the morning, crested with men in the afternoon, and ebbed with exhaustion as the sun slid down the sky. When the last body was dragged away, when the last trumpet sounded, the crowd dispersed, weary yet satisfied. The amphitheatre, stained and silent, waited for the next day, the next games, the next tide of blood. For the gladiators it was never truly over. As the people filed out, laughing, drunk, already speaking of favourites and rumours, the fighters were herded back into their cells. Some limped, some bled, some were carried. A few were victorious, celebrated, perhaps granted gifts of coin, of food, of favour. But for all, the cycle began again. Training tomorrow, waiting tomorrow, another day, another death, another spectacle. The games consumed men and beasts alike, but the machine never stopped. The empire itself was built on such rhythms, endless, inexhaustible. Close your eyes and you might hear it. The echo of a trumpet, the roar of a crowd, the scrape of sword against shield, the hiss of a breath cut short. This was a Roman day at the amphitheatre. This was how an empire passed its hours. The crowd was not merely present at the games. The crowd was the games. Without them, the spectacle was meaningless, a performance without an audience, a cry into silence. But with them, tens of thousands packed shoulder to shoulder in the tiers of the amphitheatre, from the shaded seats of the wealthy to the blistering upper rows, where the poor baked under the sun, the games came alive. The roar of the crowd was a force greater than any gladiator's arm, greater even than the emperor himself. It began as a murmur. Dawn, when the first spectators filed in, the arena hummed with conversation. Voices mingled. Greetings, wagers, gossip, the complaints of the hungry, the laughter of the hopeful. The amphitheatre filled slowly, the sound rising like water in a basin. By the time the beasts were released into the sand, it was already a sea of noise, each voice one droplet in a vast tide. And when the first blood was drawn, when a lion's claws tore through a condemned man, the murmur turned to thunder. The amphitheatre shook with it, roars, gasps, cheers, laughter, thousands of people, thousands of reactions, yet together forming a single living sound. Why did they cheer? Why did they laugh at agony, call for death, delight in suffering? Part of it was tradition, part of it was power, and part of it was something darker, something buried deep in the human heart. For the Romans, the arena was not simply entertainment, it was identity. To watch the games was to be Roman. To cry out for blood was to share in the empire's might, to feel, for a fleeting moment, the same authority that ruled provinces and commanded legions. When the crowd roared for death, they echoed the empire's power to conquer, to destroy, to decide. But there was also something more immediate, more visceral. The games allowed the people to shed their daily lives, their poverty, their toil, their insignificance. A labourer who spent his week in sweat and struggle could sit in the amphitheatre and bellow his will, his voice joining thousands of others in deciding the fate of a man on the sand. For those few hours he mattered. For those few hours he held power over life and death. And the roar was intoxicating. The louder the crowd, the more it fed upon itself. One shout became 10, 10 became 100, until the whole amphitheatre was one vast storm of sound. It rolled over the gladiators, over the editor, over the emperor himself. At times, even the ruler of Rome bowed to it. If the crowd demanded mercy, he could scarcely refuse. If they screamed for death, his hand was forced. The people's voice, amplified by tens of thousands, became an irresistible command. The psychology of the crowd was strange and dangerous. Men who, alone, might never raise a hand in cruelty, found themselves swept away by collective fervour. Women who, in their homes, might weep for a neighbour's suffering, laughed when a gladiator's blood spattered across the sand. Children who might fear the dark shouted for death in the daylight. The roar was a spell, and once inside it, few could resist. There was rhythm in it too. The crowd could sway like an ocean. One moment they booed and jeered, hurling scraps of food at a cowardly fighter. The next, they erupted in wild adoration for a man who stood his ground bravely. They could demand mercy in one breath, cruelty in the next, and woe to the gladiator who misread them, who failed to perform with the right mixture of courage, skill, and theatre. For the crowd was not just an audience, it was judge, jury, and executioner. To sit in that amphitheatre, high upon the stone steps, was to be caught in the pull of something vast, something greater than oneself. The sound vibrated in the chest, rattled the bones, blurred the line between personal thought and collective will. By the time the games reached their climax, the roar was no longer a sound from outside, it was within. It became the heartbeat of the crowd itself, steady, relentless, unstoppable. And when the day was done, when the arena lay silent again, that roar lingered. It echoed in the ears of the gladiators, in the halls of the ludus, in the dreams of the children who had shouted for blood. It was not just noise, it was Rome itself, alive, fierce, unyielding. Close your eyes and perhaps you can hear it still. 100 heartbeats, 1,000, 10,000, blending together into one. A roar that could grant mercy, a roar that could demand death, a roar that shook the empire. The clash of steel has ended. The sand is darkened with blood, marked with the footprints of struggle. One gladiator stands, weary but alive, his chest rising and falling with laboured breath. His opponent lies on the ground, armour dented, weapon lost, eyes pleading. Around them, silence falls like a curtain. This was the moment. The most terrible, the most profound silence in Rome. Tens of thousands who only moments ago roared like thunder now sat breathless, waiting. The outcome no longer belonged to the gladiators. It belonged to the crowd and to the gesture of a hand. The defeated fighter raised a hand in surrender, a gesture called misio. His life hung suspended, neither lost nor saved. He had fought bravely, perhaps, or perhaps poorly. He had entertained, perhaps enough, perhaps not. His worth was no longer measured by his will to survive, but by how he had performed. And so the people decided. A chant might rise, "Amit! Mit! Spare him!" All with equal fervour, "A jugular kill." Their cries carried like wind, swelling and crashing, until even the emperor himself could not ignore them. And then the signal, the infamous pollis verso, so the turning of the thumb. But here lies one of history's lingering mysteries, for scholars still debate what it truly meant. Did a thumb pointed upwards signify death, a thrust toward the sky mimicking the sword's fatal strike? Did a turned thumb, pressed downward, mean mercy, the sword sheathed? Or was it the opposite? The truth is clouded by centuries of retelling, Ming. What is certain is this. The thumb, a small gesture of the hand, carried the weight of a man's existence. One motion, swift and casual, decided whether he would rise to fight again or sink forever into the dust. Imagine the silence in those moments, a silence thicker than any roar. The crowd waits. A crowd waits. The emperor, seated in his high place, raises his hand. His thumb moves. A wave of sound crashes through the amphitheatre. If mercy is granted, the defeated fighter is pulled to his feet, perhaps bloodied, perhaps broken, but alive to fight another day. Relief floods him, though he knows the reprieve is temporary. His chains will still await him. His body will still carry its scars. His survival is a gift, but a grim one. If death is chosen, the victor approaches, weapon in hand. The fallen man prepares himself as best he can, bracing for the final blow. The crowd leans forward, eager for the end. A sword pierces flesh, the sand grows darker, and then, only then, do the voices rise again, satisfied, thrilled, alive with the drama of blood. It is chilling how casually life could be taken. A gesture of the hand, a motion no larger than the flick of a wrist, determining the boundary between existence and oblivion. To the Romans, it was ritual. To the gladiator, it was everything. And so the games went on, day after day, year after year, with countless men bowing their heads beneath the judgment of the thumb. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it, the hush, the waiting, the single gesture, and the final breath. A man's destiny, determined not by the gods, not by fate, but by the whim of strangers and the turn of a thumb. Glory. It was the most fragile treasure in Rome. More fleeting than wealth, more dangerous than power, yet more intoxicating than both. For a gladiator, born in chains, stripped of name and freedom, glory was the one thing he could still touch, and so he reached for it, even knowing it could burn his hand. When a gladiator fought with unusual skill, when his movements were swift, his strikes precise, his courage unbroken, the crowd noticed. Whispers began in the taverns. Did you see him? The one with the curved blade. The one who would not fall. Children repeated his name in play, copying his stance, pretending to parry unseen blows. Merchants carved crude images of him on cups, lamps, or scraps of pottery, selling them for a few coins. For the first time in his life, the gladiator might feel something strange. Adoration. Men who once would have spat at him now shouted his name. Women who would not have looked his way now left garlands of flowers at the gate of the ludus. Even senators, even emperors, sometimes leaned forward with genuine interest when such a man stepped into the arena. And yet this glory was not his own. It did not free him. It did not change his chains. The adoration belonged not to him as a man, but to the spectacle he created. Rome did not love him. Rome loved the performance, the brief illusion of power and beauty in violence. When the illusion faded, so too did the glory. But for those who reached its highest peaks, the rewards were tantalizing. A gladiator of great renown might be granted a wooden sword, the rudis a symbol of freedom, his service in the arena complete. Some won enough favour to become instructors, teaching new recruits within the safety of the school. A rare few rose so high that even aristocrats sought their company, treating them not as slaves, but as curiosities, as living legends. Yet glory was a double-edged blade. Fame drew jealousy from other gladiators, resentment from trainers, suspicion from owners. The higher one climbed, the harder one fell. A man cheered today might be mocked tomorrow. A crowd that once shouted his name could just as easily demand his death if he faltered. Glory made a gladiator visible, but visibility was dangerous in a world where every fight risked ending in silence. Imagine the weight of that knowledge, stepping into the arena, hearing tens of thousands call your name, and knowing that those same voices could call just as loudly for your execution. The same hands that threw garlands could, with a turn of the thumb, condemn you, and still many reached for it. For glory meant more than survival. It meant proof that, even in chains, even on the edge of death, a man could burn brightly enough to be remembered. So they fought harder, risked more, not simply to live another day, but to carve their names into the memory of Rome, if only for a season. But in the still hours of night, when the noise of the arena had faded, when the garlands withered and the lamps burned low, every gladiator knew the truth. Glory was a mask worn briefly. Beneath it, he remained what he always was, a man caught between freedom and death, between admiration and contempt, walking the narrow line of survival. And thus glory was both gift and curse, both salvation and doom. It could lift a man above the dust, or bury him beneath it even faster. In the twilight of the Roman evening, when the arena's dust had settled and the lamps flickered along the streets, there were whispers that floated through the city like perfume, whispers of women and gladiators. It is one of the strangest paradoxes of Rome. These men, despised as slaves, marked by scars and bound in chains, carried an allure that cut across the rigid lines of class and status. To Roman women, especially those confined by the heavy expectations of marriage and decorum, the gladiator represented something raw, untamed, and forbidden. Seneca, the philosopher, once scoffed at it, remarking how foolish it was that noble women would sigh over men smeared with blood. Juvenal, the satirist, sharpened his words into daggers, mocking aristocratic wives who pined for gladiators. To him it was a sign of Rome's decay, proof that women had lost all sense of shame. But behind their sharp words lies a truth. The allure was real. Why? Perhaps because gladiators lived always at the edge of life and death. They radiated danger, and danger, even in chains, has a strange magnetism. Perhaps it was their bodies, honed by relentless training, scarred but strong, shaped into instruments of survival. Or perhaps it was simply rebellion, the thrill of desiring a man society had marked as untouchable, a man outside the carefully woven web of duty, politics, and family alliances. Stories ripple through history like faint echoes. There was Epia, the senator's wife, mocked in Juvenal's verses, who abandoned her household to follow a gladiator to Egypt. There were whispers of matrons slipping coins to guards, securing secret trysts in the shadowed corridors of the ludus. Some even left offerings at the training schools, tokens of affection that blurred the line between worship and lust. But these liaisons were never without risk. For the women, discovery meant scandal, disgrace, sometimes exile. For the gladiators, such affairs could be dangerous, for they reminded society that a slave might reach into the world of the free, crossing boundaries that Rome preferred to keep firm. Yet, the forbidden always calls louder than the safe. And so, behind the roar of the crowd, another drama unfolded quietly. Notes slipped through bars, glances exchanged during processions, rumours swelling until they became part of the gladiators' legend. Some men basked in it, feeding their fame. Others dreaded it, knowing that desire could draw them into intrigues beyond the arena, where the stakes were just as deadly as the sword. To Rome, it was scandal. To poets, it was satire. But to the women themselves, perhaps it was simply a reminder that behind the rigid masks of Roman society, hearts still longed, eyes still wandered, and chains could not restrain every passion. And so the gladiator became more than a fighter. He became a forbidden symbol, half fantasy, half danger, a mirror reflecting the desires Rome tried to deny. The Colosseum, vast and eternal, did not truly belong to the gladiators, nor to the roaring crowds who filled its seats. It belonged to the emperor. Every stone, every spectacle, every scream of triumph or agony unfolded beneath the shadow of imperial power. For in Rome the games were never merely entertainment, they were politics carved in blood. From the moment the emperor entered the arena, the day shifted. Trumpets sounded, banners fluttered, and tens of thousands rose to their feet, not only to honour the man, but to remind themselves who commanded both life and death. The games reflected his will. If he sought to display mercy, gladiators might be spared with a dramatic gesture, drawing cheers for his benevolence. If he hungered for cruelty, the sands might darken with blood until the crowd, sated and weary, stumbled home in silence. Julius Caesar had understood the power of spectacle. He staged games to win the love of the people, offering them not just battles but feasts, processions, and exotic beasts. For him, each gladiator's fight was a coin spent in the marketplace of loyalty. Augustus, cautious and calculating, refined this tradition, making the arena a stage where order and Roman virtue were celebrated, even as men were slaughtered. But it was under emperors like Caligula, Nero, and Commodus that the games slipped from politics into madness. Caligula, with his taste for the bizarre, staged combats at night under lamplight, demanding fresh entertainments when the day had already been soaked in blood. Nero, ever the performer, blurred the lines between ruler and actor, sometimes appearing himself in spectacles, his vanity stretching even into the sands. And Commodus, took it further still. He fancied himself a gladiator, striding into the arena dressed not as emperor but as fighter, forcing Rome to watch as their ruler swung a sword not in defense of empire, but in pursuit of his own fantasy. For the gladiators, the emperor's presence was both fortune and peril. A man might be spared, his name remembered for generations, because an emperor wished to be seen as merciful. Another might be condemned in an instant, slain not for defeat, but because the emperor's mood soured. A thumb turned, a glance cast, and fate shifted like sand in the wind. The crowd too sensed this. When they roared, they were not merely urging the victor's hand, but speaking to the emperor himself, feeding his vanity, challenging his mercy, begging him to play God. And often he obliged, for what was the purpose of absolute power if not to exercise it before the eyes of all? Thus the games became mirrors of imperial whim. Some emperors sought love, others fear, and some, like Commodus, simply sought amusement. But always the gladiator remained the pawn, his struggle magnified not only by the arena's walls, but by the shifting tempers of Rome's supreme rulers. The emperor sat high above, shaded beneath a canopy, the world's most powerful man. The gladiator stood below, armoured, sweating, his breath heavy in the dust. Between them stretched the gulf of empire. Yet in that fleeting moment of judgment, they were bound together, ruler and slave, deciding one another's legacies in the hush before the crowd's next roar. It is tempting to think of the gladiatorial games as a Roman treasure, contained within the Colosseum's towering arches, but Rome was never just a city. It was an empire, sprawling, vast, stitched together by roads, rivers, and legions. And just as Roman law, language, and architecture spread to its provinces, so too did its appetite for blood. In Gaul, in Britain, in North Africa, and across the provinces of the East, amphitheatres rose like smaller shadows of Rome itself. Stone circles, sometimes grand, sometimes humble, were built in provincial towns, funded by wealthy governors or eager elites who wished to flatter their imperial masters. These were not just gifts of entertainment, they were symbols of Romanization, reminders that even in the farthest corners of empire, the citizens were bound by the same rhythms, the same spectacles, the same roar of the crowd. In these distant arenas, the games were no less brutal. Gladiators fought under the same blazing sun, cheered by audiences who spoke with accents not of Rome, but of Carthage, Londinium, or Lugdunum. Wild animals brought from the very lands where the amphitheatre stood were released into the sands, lions from Africa, bears from the northern forests, leopards from the mountains of Asia Minor. Each beast was both local and exotic, a reminder of Rome's reach and its appetite for mastery over nature, and yet the further the games travelled, the more they changed. In smaller towns, where fewer gladiators were available, matches might be less frequent, the training schools more modest. Sometimes condemned criminals or prisoners of war filled the ranks, their deaths staged more for punishment than glory. In these provincial spectacles, the line between theatre and execution blurred even further. Still, the games bound the empire together. A Roman citizen in Antioch could sit in an amphitheatre and feel the same shiver of excitement, the same anticipation of blood as his counterpart in Rome itself. The structure of the day, the morning hunts, the midday executions, the afternoon duels, remained constant, a ritual repeated across thousands of miles. It was as if the empire's heartbeat pulsed through the very sand of these arenas. For the gladiators themselves, being sent to the provinces was both a curse and a reprieve. Some found obscurity in small towns, their names forgotten even as they fought and bled. Others became local legends, their fame burning brightly in places where fewer fighters passed through. But whether in Rome or far from it, the truth remained unchanged. The games were never for the gladiator. They were for the crowd, they were for the empire. And so, as dusk settled on distant amphitheatres, as the last cheers faded into provincial streets, the shadow of Rome loomed. The empire had spread its appetite for spectacle like fire across dry fields, consuming city after city, until even the farthest outpost knew the sound of the trumpet, the sight of blood on sand, the final cry of the defeated. The Colosseum might have been the heart, but its pulse was felt everywhere. The sun was always the first master. Long before the heat of the day, when its light was only a pale shimmer creeping across the rooftops of Rome or Capua, the gladiators were stirred from their straw mattresses. The clang of a guard's staff on iron bars, the bark of an instructor's command, the cold air filling their lungs, all signalled that the day of training had begun. Life in the ludus was rhythm without mercy, repetition without end. Every man's body was reshaped, broken down and rebuilt, until it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the arena. First came the warm-ups, slow, grinding exercises that burned the muscles before a sword was ever lifted. Stones were carried, heavy wooden poles hefted like weapons, backs bent under loads of sand. The gladiators marched in circles, their breath rising in mist, the sound of sandals slapping dirt echoing against the stone walls. Even the weak were forced to continue, especially the weak. For the Lannister, the owner and master of the school, would waste no time on men who could not endure. Then came the drills. Wooden swords, heavier than the real ones, were thrust into their hands. Shields of crude wood and hide were strapped to weary arms. And for hours upon hours, the gladiators practiced. They swung, they stabbed, they blocked, each movement corrected with shouts, each mistake punished with a lash or a blow from a staff. To stumble was to learn through pain. To falter was to remind the body it must never falter again. The instructors, often retired gladiators themselves, watched with eyes as sharp as blades. They barked commands, demonstrated strikes, and struck without warning to test reflexes. A man was not allowed to think of himself. He was taught to think only of form, of movement, of the rhythm of survival. Strike high, step forward, shield up, pivot, strike again. Over and over until the body remembered even when the mind drifted into exhaustion. By midday, sweat soaked every tunic, muscles trembled, and yet the drills did not cease. Sparring began. Wooden blades cracked against shields, men grunted as they fell, dust clung to skin. Rivalries simmered here, in the ring of practice, where men measured themselves against each other. Some fought with fury, desperate to prove strength. Others fought with restraint, saving their strength for the day it truly mattered. But all knew that every spar, every strike, was not just practice. It was rehearsal for life or death, and still the day was not done. Afternoon meant endurance training, running, leaping, rolling in sand, carrying weights up and down narrow yards until the legs shook like reeds in the wind. Their bodies were sculpted not for beauty, but for brutality, not for freedom, but for survival. When at last the sun sank low, the training slowed. Meals were served, thick barley porridge, beans, bread, the fuel of men who needed bulk more than delicacy. And then, in the evening gloom, came silence. Men sat in their cells, bruises darkening, muscles aching, staring into shadows. Some whispered prayers to forgotten gods. Some sharpened their blades in their minds, imagining the day to come. Others simply closed their eyes and drifted, for sleep was their only escape from the endless cycle. This was the daily rhythm of the ludus. A life reduced to obedience, discipline, and exhaustion. A life trained not for freedom, but for the roar of strangers. Each dawn promised only more drills, more sweat, more pain, until the day came when the gates opened, the sand awaited, and the training would end. For in the arena, the lessons of the ludus were tested, and in that moment all the hours of sweat and blood would be measured in a single heartbeat. Pain was the one companion no gladiator could escape. It lived in the joints, in the bruised ribs, in the raw skin rubbed by leather straps. It followed them from the training yard to the cell, from the dust of the arena back to the silence of the barracks. To be a gladiator was not simply to face death. It was to live with pain as a daily teacher, as constant as the drill master's voice. Injuries were inevitable. A wooden practice sword, swung too hard in sparring, could break a nose or crack a rib. A misplaced step could wrench a knee, sending a man limping for weeks. And in the arena, the wounds were worse, cuts that split skin to the bone, punches that bled slow and steady, shattered arms that left men useless without care. Yet gladiators could not afford to fall apart. They were investments, property of the Lannister, and so the schools had their own healers, often Greek physicians or skilled slaves, men who knew just enough of medicine to keep broken bodies stitched together. Their work was rough, practical, and meant for survival rather than comfort. A gash was washed in vinegar, stitched with coarse thread, and bound tightly with linen. A broken bone might be set with wooden splints, though not always straight, leaving limbs forever twisted. Burns from hot sun or the friction of armour were soothed with simple salves of honey or oil. There was no luxury in these treatments, only necessity. The goal was not to restore beauty or erase pain, it was to send the man back into training, and eventually back into the arena. Scars became a second skin. Across shoulders, down arms, along ribs and thighs, each man carried a map of his survival. A jagged line where a blade had once slipped past his guard, a puckered mark where a spear had pierced and healed. Some men bore so many scars that their bodies seemed carved, a record of every near-death moment. These scars spoke in silence. To fellow gladiators, they told of experience, of endurance, of lessons learned in blood. To the crowd, they were trophies, the proof of battles survived, the marks of men who had faced death and returned. And to the gladiator himself, each scar was a reminder of how fragile the body was and how thin the line between life and death. There were those who limped forever after a wound, who fought with one arm weaker than the other, who lived with constant pain in the chest, the leg, the back. Yet they still returned to training, still lifted the wooden sword, still fought, for they had no choice. Some, through luck or resilience, healed stronger. They hardened into men the arena seemed unable to kill. These were the veterans, men whose bodies bore dozens of scars, whose names the crowd began to chant, whose survival itself became legend. Yet even for them, every scar was a debt owed to the arena, a tally that would one day come due. In the silence of the cells, a man might trace the line of an old wound with his finger. He might remember the flash of steel, the roar of the crowd, the hot burn of blood running down his skin. And he would know that though he lived, death had brushed against him, leaving its signature behind. For in the life of a gladiator, scars were more than wounds. They were stories, written not in ink but in flesh. They were reminders that survival itself was never victory, it was simply postponement. Gladiators lived in a world where death lingered close enough to touch. Every fight, every dawn carried the weight of chance. A misstep could end a life. A single stroke could silence a man forever. And so, in a life where nothing was secure, superstition became a kind of shield, fragile, invisible, yet fiercely believed in. Before battles, some gladiators would press small charms to their lips, tokens carved from bone or smooth stones picked up from the training yard, or tiny figures of gods bought with a few coins. These talismans had no power in themselves, yet they carried belief, and belief gave courage. A man who wore his lucky amulet felt, if only for a heartbeat, that fortune might lean his way. Prayers were whispered in many tongues. Some called on Mars, the god of war, hoping he would lend them strength. Others begged mercy from Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, that fate would not cut them down too soon. Still others turned to foreign deities, Isis of Egypt, Mithras from the east, or the shadowy spirits of their homelands far from Rome. In the darkness of their cells, men knelt or lay flat, lips moving silently, bargaining with powers they could not see. Rituals grew from habit. Some fighters tightened their belts always the same way, tied their sandals with the same knot, or stepped first into the arena with the same foot, as though a pattern could bind destiny. A sip of water, a touch of the ground, a gesture of the hand, these small acts became anchors in a storm of fear. There were omens, too, that men watched with wary eyes. A crow calling from the walls in the morning might be a warning. A stumble on the way to the arena might set a man's heart pounding, convinced that death was near. Even the roll of dice in the gambling dens of Rome was thought to echo fate, lucky numbers seen as a promise, unlucky ones a shadow of doom. Some gladiators carried scars not only on their bodies but also etched into their minds, memories of comrades who had died despite every charm and prayer. Yet still they clung to ritual, for without it they faced only emptiness, and emptiness was colder than fear. The Lannister too played into these beliefs. He allowed shrines to stand within the ludus. Offerings of bread, oil, or wine were laid before statues of gods, their faces worn smooth by countless hands. A few drops of blood from a training wound might even be dabbed on an altar, as though giving a preview of the greater sacrifice that might soon be demanded. When the day of combat came, as the gladiator stood waiting at the gate of the arena, the noise of the crowd trembling through the stones, he might close his eyes and whisper one last plea. Not for victory, perhaps, but simply for survival, to fight another day, to return to the cell alive. And sometimes when a blade struck but missed the heart, when a spear glanced off a helmet instead of piercing flesh, when a man walked away from a fight others thought unwinnable, he would nod to himself. The charm had worked, the gods had listened, fate had been bent, if only for an instant. Superstition did not change the outcome of the games. Death claimed who it would without regard for ritual. Yet in the minds of gladiators, these small acts of faith gave shape to hope. They turned fear into something that could be carried, if not conquered. For in a world ruled by chance, to believe, even falsely, was to feel, for a moment, that you were not entirely helpless. The Roman crowd was not merely an audience. They were the breath and blood of the games, the heartbeat of the amphitheatre itself. When a gladiator stepped into the sand, he stepped also into their stories, their desires, their restless hunger for spectacle. And in that strange exchange, between man and mass, something powerful grew. Ordinary citizens, poor and wealthy alike, often followed certain gladiators as though they were heroes. Names would be whispered in markets and taverns. Did you see him strike down the Milo? Did you hear how he stood, unyielding, against two at once? These tales swelled, retold and reshaped until the fighter became larger than life. Children might scratch his likeness into walls, carved in rough graffiti, a crude helmet or sword sketched alongside his name. Merchants would sell small clay figures modelled after popular gladiators, and young men would copy their fighting stances in the streets, pretending to be them as they played. Women, too, were famously drawn to the gladiators' strange allure. Not only the common women who might press against the barriers of the arena to catch a glimpse, but also noble ladies whose rank should have kept them far from such blood-soaked passions. Some slipped love notes scratched on wax tablets to favoured fighters. Others wore amulets containing dust from the arena where their champion had fought, as though the sand itself carried a trace of his power. A few stories tell of women smuggling themselves into the gladiators' quarters, risking scandal and ruin, simply to touch the men whom Rome declared both despised and adored. For gladiators were forbidden by law from marrying respectable women, yet desire often cared little for law. Even senators and nobles, men who should have been above such fascination, sometimes became patrons of gladiators. They would sponsor them, shower them with gifts, and boast of their victories as though sharing in the glory. The fame of a skilled gladiator could ripple upward, catching even the notice of emperors, who might summon a favourite fighter for a private display or keep him close as a kind of living ornament of power. The graffiti of Pompeii, still faintly carved into ancient walls, whispers to us across centuries, crude sketches of helmets, scratched names, slogans of devotion. Crescens the net fighter is the delight of the girls, one reads. Celadus makes the girls sigh, says another. These were not kings or generals. They were men who lived in cages, trained like beasts, and yet they ignited passions that could burn across an entire city. There was a darker side to this worship as well. Fans could be fickle. A man adored one day might be abandoned the next if he faltered in the arena. The same mouths that cheered his courage could jeer at his fall or demand his death with ruthless excitement. The gladiator lived on the knife edge of public love, where fame was bright but fleeting, and devotion could turn swiftly to cruelty. Still, for many fighters, the roar of the crowd was a kind of second heartbeat. To hear their names shouted by thousands was to feel, if only for a moment, that they had become more than slaves, more than condemned men. They had become unforgettable. And so, in the strange paradox of Rome, the gladiator was both despised and exalted, outcast and idle, shamed in law but crowned in passion. His blood bought not only survival, but also memory, written in the hearts of strangers who loved him for reasons they could not explain. When the people gathered beneath the towering arches of the Colosseum, they did not believe they were watching chaos. They believed they were watching order. Every spectacle, every drop of blood was carefully arranged, choreographed as if by an invisible director. The arena was not only a place of killing, it was a theatre of death, where lives were sacrificed not at random, but according to Rome's script of power. The morning began with its prologue, the Venetians, the animal hunts. Exotic beasts, drawn from Africa, Asia and distant provinces, were unleashed upon one another or against condemned men sent to die without arms. It was not only slaughter, but also display, Rome showing its reach, its dominion over nature itself. Lions, tigers, bears, leopards, elephants, even crocodiles, their presence alone was proof of empire. To watch them die was to watch the world bow to Rome's will. By midday the tempo shifted. Executions, often staged as grim reenactments of myths, filled the interlude. So condemned men might be dressed as tragic figures from legend: Orpheus, torn apart by beasts; Icarus, burned or dashed upon the ground; Hercules, consumed by fire. The crowd watched, not with horror, but with a solemn satisfaction, as if theatre and justice had entwined. Here, punishment was spectacle, and spectacle was lesson. And then, as the afternoon sun fell at its fiercest, the curtain rose on the main act, the gladiatorial combats. These were not formless melees, but tightly choreographed duels, pairing different types of fighters like roles in a drama. The heavy Mamillo, with his broad helmet and sword, set against the nimble Retiarius with his net and trident. Strength versus speed, armour versus freedom. The Secutor, designed to hunt, and the 3X, armed with curved blade and high shield. Each match was a balance of opposites, designed to thrill the eye. The sand was the stage, but the crowd was the chorus. They gasped, they cheered, they hissed. Their voices carried the rhythm of the fight, swelling in intensity like the rising music of a play. The editor of the games, often a wealthy sponsor, or even the emperor himself, was the hidden playwright, having chosen the pairs, the order, the surprises. Even the deaths themselves were staged with ritual. When a gladiator fell, the drama did not end until the final gesture was made. The defeated man would raise a finger, seeking mercy. The victor would step back, waiting. And the crowd, like an audience asked to decide the fate of a tragic hero, roared its judgment. The editor, as final arbiter, raised his thumb one way or the other. It was not simply killing. It was theatre, with a climax as suspenseful as any drama ever written. And sometimes the games transcended even this. Amphitheatres were flooded to stage mock naval battles, entire miniature seas filled with ships, men and death. Wooden scenery was erected to turn the arena into forests, mountains, palaces, so that every fight was not only a contest, but a scene, as if the gods themselves had descended into the sand to play their roles. The arena was Rome's mirror, a place where violence became pageant, cruelty became ritual, and death became art. In those hours of spectacle, the empire displayed its power, its wealth, its dominion over life itself. The people believed they were watching entertainment, but beneath it all, they were watching Rome remind itself of what it was: master of the world, master of men, master of fate. And when the day's theatre ended, when the sand was stained and the bodies dragged away, the people returned home carrying the memory of what they had seen. Not merely death, but a story acted out in blood and dust. To the common Roman, the games were a gift. But to those who gave them, they were an investment. The gladiatorial shows, vast and ruinously expensive, were funded not by accident, but by design. Every senator, every general, every ambitious man who sought the favour of the people knew that the arena was the surest path to glory. Rome was a city fed not only by bread, but by spectacle. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses, became the very formula for ruling the restless masses. A newly elected magistrate might begin his career by sponsoring games, using his family's fortune or the treasury's coin to dazzle the people. To pay for exotic beasts, to hire trainers, to flood the arena, to build wooden sets that rose and crumbled, it was ruinous. And yet, it was worth every coin. For a well-staged set of games could buy loyalty more surely than decrees or soldiers. The crowd remembered generosity. They remembered who gave them blood. Generals returning from war often marked their triumph with games. Victories abroad translated into spectacles at home, where the conquered peoples might be paraded, condemned prisoners slain, and gladiators set against each other as living proof of Rome's might. For the general, the arena became an extension of the battlefield, a place to remind the citizens of the empire's reach and of the man who had brought it to them. The emperors, too, found the arena indispensable. Augustus used games to steady a weary republic, turned empire, offering order and stability in the form of ritualized violence. Trajan celebrated victories in Dacia with spectacles said to involve thousands of gladiators over months. Titus inaugurated the Colosseum itself with 100 days of games, each day more elaborate than the last. For emperors, the games were not a pastime, they were theatre of legitimacy. Even their presence in the stands was calculated. When the emperor sat beneath the awning, visible to tens of thousands, every gesture was magnified. A nod could send ripples through the crowd. A raised thumb could mean death. To see the emperor decide a man's fate was to be reminded of the absolute nature of his power. The amphitheatre was a palace without walls, a throne room with sand instead of marble. Yet politics in the arena was not always smooth. Crowds could turn. An unpopular sponsor who tried to cut costs or who failed to provide excitement might be mocked or even attacked. Demands for more games could become loud, insistent, even dangerous. The people had learned the currency of spectacle, and they spent it boldly. To give no games was to invite resentment. To give poor games was to invite scorn. And once the crowds turned, even the strongest politician felt their power weaken. The games also became a weapon. Senators might outdo one another in lavishness, competing not in speeches but in blood. An emperor might silence unrest by announcing a new series of spectacles, distracting the people from hunger or dissent. In times of crisis, the promise of lions, gladiators, and free bread could soothe even the most restless mob. So the arena was more than sand and blood. It was politics in motion, power made visible. The gladiator's sword was only part of the performance. Behind him stood the shadow of the sponsor, the magistrate, the emperor. Every cry of the crowd was not only for the fighters, but for those who had given them the show. And so, as we leave this chapter, we see the truth. The games were not only for amusement. They were Rome's most enduring language of rule, written in spectacle, spoken in blood, and understood by all, from the lowest slave to the emperor himself. Imagine the first sight of the Colosseum, rising before a weary traveller arriving in Rome. It is not merely a building. It is an entire world of arches stacked upon arches, rings of stone so vast that it seems impossible they were raised by human hands. 4 stories tall, with seating for 50,000 or more, it dominated the city as though it were a second capital. A new temple where the god to be worshipped was spectacle itself. But Rome was not alone. Across the empire, from the rocky coasts of North Africa to the green hills of Gaul, amphitheatres rose wherever Roman authority stretched. They were symbols as much as structures, reminders that Rome's culture of blood had spread with her legion. Each one was a promise. Here, too, the empire will bring you the games. The amphitheatre's design was cunning. Ovals, not circles, ensured that no seat was too far from the action. The sloping tiers drew the eye down to the sand, funneling attention toward the arena's centre. Beneath the seats ran corridors and stairways, ingeniously arranged so that tens of thousands could enter and exit with startling speed. Stone vomitoria, as they were called, disgorged the crowd like rivers bursting their banks, a design so clever that even modern stadiums still echo it. Beneath the arena floor lay another world. Wooden planks, later replaced by stone and iron trapdoors, covered a labyrinth of chambers, pulleys and elevators. Here animals waited in dark cages. Here gladiators stood in silence before their cue. With a winch or a counterweight, a gate might snap open and a lion would burst into daylight as though conjured from the earth itself. Stagecraft and slaughter blended until the arena seemed alive, breathing death through its hidden lungs. And then there was the seating. Every rank of society had its place, carved into stone as rigidly as into law. Senators closest to the sand, their togas bright beneath the awnings. Equestrians just behind, citizens higher up, divided by wealth and class. Women and slaves at the farthest edge pressed against the sky. The amphitheatre was Rome in miniature, its hierarchy made visible in stone, its divisions stacked tier by tier. The Colosseum itself was a marvel of engineering, arches of travertine stone locked together with iron clamps, concrete foundations sunk deep into the earth. A great awning, the velarium, stretched by sailors of the fleet, shading the crowd like a vast sail caught upon an invisible sea. In the sunlight, the fabric rippled. In the wind it groaned. To sit beneath it was to feel as though one were in the belly of a ship, carried not upon water, but upon blood. And yet the amphitheatre was not silent stone. It was built to magnify. The roar of the crowd rose like thunder, rolling back and forth across the tiers, amplified by the curve of the walls. The cries of the wounded, the clash of steel, the bellow of beasts, all were caught and hurled back into the air, so that no sound was ever lost. The building itself was an instrument, and the crowd, the gladiators, the animals, were the notes. To stand inside such a place, even empty, even centuries later, is to feel the weight of it. The stones still whisper of movement, of 100,000 sandaled feet. The corridors still hold echoes, as though voices once shouted there and have never fully gone. These were not just buildings, they were monuments of control, built to last, built to remind every soul that Rome's reach was vast, her spectacles eternal. So the architecture of blood was not merely practical, it was symbolic. It told the crowd that Rome had mastered not only men and beasts, but stone itself. The amphitheatre was a city's heart made visible, and when the games began, that heart thundered. The Romans understood something primal. A crowd never rests long on repetition. To keep tens of thousands entranced, the arena had to change, to surprise, to overwhelm. And so the Colosseum and its lesser cousins became not only places of slaughter, but stages of wonder, their stones concealing an arsenal of tricks. Beneath the floor of the Colosseum lay the Hypogeum, a subterranean labyrinth of corridors, pulleys and cages. Here, men worked unseen, sweating in the dark, waiting for the cue to haul on ropes or unfasten bolts. Above, the crowd gasped as a panther seemed to spring from nowhere, or as a tree appeared to grow from the sand itself, a stage prop rising smoothly through a hidden trapdoor. Animals, gladiators, and even entire sets could be lifted into the arena on elevators powered by teams of men straining in unison. Wooden platforms creaked upward, iron counterweights slid downward, and what had been empty ground seconds before became a jungle scene, complete with rocks, greenery, and roaring beasts. The crowd cheered, marvelling at what seemed like magic, but it was the sweat of slaves, the genius of engineers, that made the illusion. At times the engineering grew even more ambitious. There are accounts, half believed, half legend, of the arena being flooded to host mock naval battles. Imagine the sand raked away, the floorboards opened, and channels filled with water drawn from aqueducts. Small boats, manned by prisoners or trained fighters, clashed upon an artificial sea while the crowd roared from the safety of dry stone tiers. Whether these spectacles were as frequent as later storytellers claimed, or only occasional marvels, the idea of it alone thrilled the Roman imagination. The Colosseum became not just an arena, but an ocean when the emperor willed it, and there were illusions beyond mere mechanics. Painted scenery, collapsing buildings, stagecraft borrowed from the theatres of Greece, all found their way into the games. A condemned man might be dressed as a mythic hero, only to be slain in a manner echoing some familiar tale. A wooden temple might stand in the centre of the arena, then burn and crumble mid-performance, its destruction serving as the climax of a bloody myth reenacted with living bodies. For the Romans, the line between theatre and execution blurred until death itself became a kind of performance art. Even the arena floor could change character, sometimes strewn with coloured sand to dazzle the eye, sometimes scattered with perfumed petals to soften the stench of blood. Sometimes transformed into forests, deserts, or rocky landscapes meant to transport the spectators into another world. A day at the Games was not simply a matter of watching men fight. It was a journey through shifting stages, each new act demanding fresh awe. And all of this was hidden beneath the seamless flow of the event. To the crowd, it seemed effortless, as though the gods themselves reshaped the arena at a whim. But behind the scenes, teams of engineers, builders and labourers toiled constantly, turning winches, hauling ropes, adjusting sets. Their names were forgotten, their work uncelebrated, yet without them, the grand illusions of Rome would have been impossible. The engineering of spectacle was as much a tool of power as the architecture itself. It showed that Rome could command not only men and beasts, but also nature, water, fire, and even myth. The emperor, seated in his box, seemed the conductor of this vast performance, his will made real through wood, rope and stone. The amphitheatre was, in truth, a living machine, a stage of illusions where blood met artifice. It dazzled the eye, numbed the heart, and bound the people together in wonder. For when the crowd gasped at a sudden transformation, when they marvelled at ships upon an inland sea or lions springing from hidden doors, they were reminded that Rome itself was a miracle of engineering, and that its emperors were the keepers of that miracle. The morning haze still lingered over the arena when the first sounds stirred the waiting crowd. Not the clash of steel yet, not the roar of beasts, but the long, brassy note of the tuba, the Roman war trumpet. Its blast carried across the tiers, sharp and commanding, a signal that the day of spectacle had begun. To thousands of ears it was more than music. It was announcement, expectation, a summons to attention, for sound framed the rhythm of the games. The Romans, masters of drama, knew that sight alone could not hold an audience. They layered spectacle with sound until the arena itself seemed to breathe like a great instrument. The deep beat of drums, slow and heavy, rolled through the stone, a heartbeat for the crowd to follow. Flutes and horns wailed above the din, rising in shrill spirals that set the nerves alight. The music was not delicate. It was bold, brash, designed to quicken the pulse and prime the crowd for violence. When gladiators entered, it was to music. Trumpets announced them, drums kept their step, and sometimes a chorus of pipes gave the illusion of triumph before a single blow had been struck. The sound told the crowd how to feel. Excitement, dread, anticipation. Without it, the silence of thousands waiting might have hung too heavy. With it, the amphitheatre became a stage, each note painting mood upon the air. Even more powerful than instruments, however, were voices. The crowd itself was a kind of music, tens of thousands speaking, laughing, shouting, chanting in unison. A lone man's cry of approval might fade into the air, but when thousands shouted together, the sound became physical. It pressed against the body like wind, it echoed from the stone, it filled the lungs of those who screamed and the ears of those who listened. The voice of the arena was not many voices. It was one, vast and thunderous, rolling like a storm through the open sky. The chants had a rhythm of their own. Names of gladiators rose and fell, repeated like refrains of a song. Spiculus, 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 the cry for mercy, mitt, or for death could spread like fire across the tiers, swelling until it became irresistible. The emperor himself, sitting in majesty, could not ignore such a sound. The crowd's roar, in the end, was power. It guided thumbs, decided fates, made and unmade men in the space of a heartbeat. And beneath it all was the sound of the games themselves, the scrape of steel, the crash of shields, the bellow of animals, the wet gasp of men struck down. These sounds blended with the instruments, with the shouting, until the whole became a symphony of death. The Romans did not flinch from it. They listened with the same fascination as they watched, each cry another note in the music of blood. Sound was not only spectacle, it was memory. When a crowd poured from the amphitheatre at day's end, they carried not just images but echoes. The trumpet's call, the drum's relentless beat, the roar that decided a man's life. Long after the sand was raked smooth and the bodies carried away, the voices still rang in the ears, haunting or thrilling, depending on the heart that remembered them. Thus the games were never silent. They were music and voice woven into violence, a theatre not only of sight but of sound. The amphitheatre was an instrument, and Rome itself the player, striking chords of awe and terror until the people were bound to it by rhythm as much as by blood. When the final blow had been struck, when the victor stood panting beneath the weight of his own survival, and the vanquished lay broken in the dust, a hush often fell over the arena. Not silence, never silence, but a shifting murmur, as though tens of thousands had exhaled together, waiting for the judgment. And then the thumb, raised or turned, delivered its verdict, and the man upon the sand either staggered to his feet or braced for the final cut. Death in the arena was not hidden. It was ritualized, deliberate. A gladiator was not meant to die as a thief in an alley, or a soldier lost in the chaos of battle. His death was framed, performed, made part of the spectacle itself. Some were run through cleanly, collapsing without a cry. Others met death with defiance, thrusting their necks forward to the sword, demanding it come swiftly. The Romans admired such composure. They called it decus, a kind of grim dignity, a final honour that even a condemned man could seize. Once life had left him, the ritual shifted. Slaves dressed as the god Mercury would enter, prodding the body with a hot iron rod, ensuring the man was truly gone. Another, masked as Pluto, lord of the underworld, would drag the corpse away, hooking it like a carcass of meat. This was no gentle removal. It was practical, efficient, yet also symbolic. Even in death, the gladiator played a role in the theatre of Rome. The bodies were hauled to a place beneath the amphitheatre, stripped, and dealt with according to rank, fortune, or obscurity. Those who were beloved, or who had won their freedom through many victories, might be honoured with a proper funeral. Wealthy patrons sometimes paid for fine burials, raising small monuments inscribed with names, victories, and stylized carvings of helmets and swords. These gravestones still whisper their stories, scattered fragments of lives once lived beneath the shadow of the arena. But many more simply vanished into anonymity. Their bodies were cast into pits or burned without ceremony, reduced to ash and dust, their names forgotten by nightfall. They had lived as entertainment, and in death they were discarded like broken props of a play that had reached its final act. Yet memory lingered, not always in stone, but in the minds of those who had seen them fight. A crowd might recall the skill of a swordsman, the bravery of a doomed man who stood his ground, or the beauty of a death faced without flinching. Roman poets sometimes wrote verses of such men, turning fleeting lives into words that outlived them by centuries. Children played at being their favourites, echoing their moves in the streets. Women whispered names of gladiators into the dark, and so, though many were forgotten in flesh, some endured in memory, half men, half legend, their deaths echoing in the hearts of those who had watched them fall. The sand was raked smooth, the next day's spectacle prepared, but for a brief moment between, the amphitheatre held its breath, still carrying the weight of those who had perished, for in Rome, even death was not private. It was part of the great machine of spectacle. And a gladiator's end, whether honoured or forgotten, became another note in the endless symphony of blood and memory that was the Roman Games. Imagine the years stretched like a chain, day upon day of training, of sweat, of wounds that never quite healed. The endless drills, the jeers of the crowd, the sudden deaths of companions. For most gladiators, there was no end but the grave. Yet, dangling before them, like a dream barely believed in, was the promise of liberty. Rome, cruel though it was, did hold out this single prize, that a gladiator who survived long enough might be granted release, and with it, the simple dignity of being his own man again. The symbol of that release was as sharp and shining as the tools of their captivity, the rudis, a wooden sword. It was no weapon of war, but rather a token, smooth and harmless, carved from pale wood. To receive it in the arena was a moment unlike any other. The games would pause, the victor or the long-serving gladiator would stand battered but alive, and before the eyes of the crowd, the editor of the games, the sponsor, perhaps even the emperor himself, would extend the rudis. It meant no longer a slave of the sand, no longer bound to fight unless by choice. Some wept upon receiving it. Others lifted it high, their tears swallowed by the roar of tens of thousands. Imagine that. Men who had known only chains and blood, now holding a piece of wood as though it were the most precious treasure in the world. And for them it was. It was proof they had bent fate to their will, proof they had endured where others had fallen. But freedom was never simple. Many who won the rudis were left with bodies scarred beyond repair, bones crooked from breaks, eyes clouded from strikes. They stepped out of the amphitheatre alive, yes, but carrying with them the weight of all they had suffered. Some became instructors, training new generations of gladiators within the ludus. Others drifted into obscurity, living quietly, their glory behind them. Phew. A few, strangely, even chose to return to the arena, for the roar of the crowd had become a kind of intoxicating music they could not live without. There are inscriptions still surviving on tombstones that tell of such men. One speaks of a gladiator who fought for 20 years, earning his freedom and dying peacefully at an old age. Another recalls one who, having gained his liberty, dedicated his winnings to the gods, perhaps in thanks, perhaps in relief that he had escaped what most never could. The stories of freed gladiators were whispered as legends. They were the proof that survival was possible, that fate was not always cruel. And for those still trapped within the walls of the ludus, the image of a man, walking free with a wooden sword in hand, was as bright as any dream of the gods. Still, such freedom was the exception, not the rule. For every gladiator who raised a rudis, dozens more sank into the dust, their names forgotten by nightfall. Yet the possibility of liberty, however faint, gave the condemned a reason to keep fighting, a spark of hope in a life otherwise ruled by chains. And so the rudis was more than wood. It was a symbol of survival against all odds. It was the dream that, in a world of blood and death, a man might still step beyond the arena gates not as a slave, not as a corpse, but as himself. For centuries, the arena had been the beating heart of Rome's spectacles. It was here that emperors displayed their power, that the people tasted both terror and delight, that men lived and died for entertainment. Yet even the most enduring institutions are not immune to the slow erosion of time. By the later days of the empire, the games that had once drawn tens of thousands were beginning to lose their hold. The reasons were many, and they stretched across centuries. Some were practical, the sheer expense of the spectacles. To fill an arena with beasts from Africa, with exotic animals and elaborate stage machinery, to house and feed entire schools of gladiators, this demanded immense sums of money. In the age of Augustus and his heirs, such costs had been borne gladly, for the empire was rich, its coffers swollen with conquest. But as Rome's borders faltered, as wars dragged on, as treasuries thinned, the burden of these games grew heavier. Others' reasons were cultural. The empire itself was changing. In the provinces far from Rome, not every city had the taste, or the wealth, for endless bloodletting. The amphitheatres stood, yes, but in many places the spectacles dwindled into smaller, humbler affairs. In the great capital itself, whispers began to rise among certain philosophers and moralists, that perhaps such slaughter was not glory but cruelty, not strength but waste. Seneca had once written of his disgust at the noon executions, where helpless men were slaughtered without even the pretense of battle. Centuries later, more voices would echo this unease, and then there was the rising tide of a new faith, Christianity. Slowly at first, then more powerfully, it spread through the empire, bringing with it a vision of the world that recoiled at the amphitheatre's carnage. To the Christians, the games were a theatre of sin, an affront to the sanctity of life. Though many early Christians themselves were hurled into those arenas, dying as martyrs before jeering crowds, their faith endured. In time, would not only survive the arena, but outlive it. By the 4th century, under emperors like Constantine and his heirs, the games still lingered, but the spirit had gone out of them. Records show gladiators still fought, still trained, still bled in the sand, but their world was fading. Finally, in 404 AD, after the martyrdom of a monk named Telemachus, who, according to legend, stepped into the arena to halt a combat and was struck down, the Emperor Honorius issued a decree forbidding gladiatorial games altogether. Whether Telemachus truly fell that day, or whether the story grew in the telling, the outcome was the same. The long age of the gladiators was ended. The amphitheatres did not vanish. They remained, their stones weathering beneath the sun and rain. Some became fortresses, others markets. The Colosseum itself, that vast ring of blood and sand, became a ruin to be plundered. Its marble taken for churches, its arches sheltering monks and hermits. The cries of the crowd, the clash of steel, the trumpet's call, all was silence. Only the empty seats, the worn stairways, and the haunted silence of the arena bore witness to what had been, and so, the games that had once defined Rome slipped into memory, their power broken not by a single blow, but by centuries of slow turning, as the empire itself formed. What had seemed eternal proved mortal after all. The blood dried, the sand settled, and Rome at last grew weary of death as spectacle. The gladiators are gone. Their voices have long since faded, their struggles buried beneath the weight of centuries. Yet even in their absence, something of them remains, shadows cast upon history, faint but enduring. The great amphitheatres still stand, though they are husks of what they were. Walk through the Colosseum today, and you will find no roar of trumpets, no clash of sword upon shield, no cries of mercy rising from the sand. Instead, there is silence, the silence of tourists moving slowly, of guides whispering old stories, of pigeons wheeling through broken arches. Yet if you listen with the imagination, you may almost hear it. The pulse of thousands of feet, the breath of the multitude, the cry of the condemned. Scattered across the empire, in stones unearthed by archaeologists, the names of gladiators surface still. Carved into tombs and epitaphs, scratched into walls as graffiti, remembered in mosaics, they remind us that these men once lived, once fought, once mattered. Some died unknown, their bones mingling with the sand. Others, for a brief moment, shone like meteors remembered as heroes of their time. Fame did not spare them from death, but it has spared a trace of their existence. And in a sense they remain alive, not only in ruins or inscriptions, but in our imagination. The very word a gladiator has outlived Rome itself, a symbol woven into stories, into films, into the way we think about courage, struggle, and the hunger of crowds. Their world was brutal, their lives short, their fate often cruel. And yet their memory endures, transformed, softened, reshaped by centuries into something more than blood and sand. The gladiators were men, captives, slaves, volunteers, the desperate and the proud alike. They lived under the shadow of death, yet in their own strange way they achieved a kind of immortality. For when we speak of them today, when we walk among the ruins of the Colosseum, when we imagine the sunlight falling on the arena floor, they are with us still. What remains of the gladiators, then, is not the violence alone. It is the paradox of their story. Men condemned to die, who became unforgettable. The arena is dust, the empire is gone. But the echo of the gladiators' footsteps still lingers in the corridors of history, faint but unbroken. And perhaps, as we drift into silence, that is enough.